Here is a question for you. You are an independent country. You have your own government, your own parliament, your own president. You fought for your independence. You won it. You have your own flag, your own national anthem, your own constitution. You are sovereign. Now, who controls your currency? For 14 African nations, home to over 210 million people, the answer to that question is France. Not metaphorically, not in the distant past. Right now, today, in 2026, the currencies of Senegal, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Benin, Togo, Chad, the Central African Republic, Gabon, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger and Guinea-Bissau are all pegged by treaty to the euro at a rate set by the European Central Bank and backed by a guarantee from the French Treasury. The currency is called the CFA franc, and its story is one of the most consequential, least discussed, and most deliberately obscured economic arrangements in the world today. Thomas Sankara, whose story we told in a previous episode, called it exactly what it is. He said, "Debt is a cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, a reconquest that turns each one of us into a financial slave." He was talking about African debt, but the same logic applies to the CFA franc. It is a monetary system designed not to develop the economies that use it, but to ensure that those economies remain financially integrated with and financially subordinate to France. Sankara was murdered in 1987. For 3.5 decades after his death, the CFA franc continued almost unchanged, and then, between 2020 and 2023, something shifted. 6 coups, 3 countries, 1 alliance, and a growing, increasingly public demand across West Africa to finally do what Sankara said in 1987, break the chain. The CFA franc was created on the 26th of December 1945 by decree of General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of post-war France. To understand why it was created, you need to understand France's position in late 1945. The country had been occupied, liberated, and was now rebuilding. It had just ratified the Bretton Woods Agreement, the international monetary framework that pegged the world's major currencies to the US dollar. As part of that ratification, the French franc was devalued, but France did not want to devalue the currency in its African colonies at the same rate. The colonies' economies, built around exporting raw materials to France, would be disrupted if the currency they used was suddenly worth less. More precisely, France did not want the resources flowing from Africa to France to become more expensive for France to acquire, so France created a separate currency for its African colonies, the Franc des colonies françaises d'Afrique, the franc of the French colonies of Africa, CFA. The name tells you everything about its purpose and its origin. It was not designed for the benefit of Africa. It was designed for the benefit of France's colonial economy. It was a tool of extraction, dressed up as monetary cooperation. The mechanism was straightforward. The CFA franc would be pegged to the French franc at a fixed rate. France would guarantee its convertibility, meaning that CFA francs could always be exchanged for French francs at the official rate. In return, the African central banks would deposit a significant portion of their foreign exchange reserves in an account at the French Treasury called the operations account. At the system's creation in 1945, African central banks were required to deposit 100% of their foreign reserves in Paris. 100%. By 1973, this had been reduced to 65%. By 2005, to 50%. For the 8 West African nations, this requirement was ended in 2019. Though the West African franc still remains pegged to the euro and France still guarantees its convertibility. For the 6 Central African nations, the 50% deposit requirement remains in place to this day. Then the colonies became independent. 15 countries across French West and Central Africa gained independence between 1960 and 1963. And with only one significant exception, which we will come to, every one of them kept the CFA franc. Why? That requires understanding what France did to the country that refused. In September 1958, France held a referendum across all its African colonies. The question was simple. Do you want to remain part of the new French community a restructured relationship with France, maintaining significant French control over defense, foreign policy, and monetary matters, or do you want full, immediate independence? The implicit threat was equally clear. De Gaulle visited each territory in person before the vote. When he arrived in Conakry, the capital of Guinea, he was met by a massive crowd and by the Guinean trade union leader and politician Ahmed Sékou Touré, who gave a speech in his presence that became one of the great declarations of African political history. We prefer poverty and freedom to riches in slavery. Every French African colony voted yes to the French community, except one. Guinea voted no. 95% of Guineans voted for immediate, full independence. On the 2nd of October 1958, Guinea became the first French African colony to gain complete independence from France. France's response was calculated, comprehensive, and brutal. Within days of the vote, France began withdrawing everything. Over 4,000 civil servants, judges, teachers, doctors, and technical administrators were pulled out of Guinea in a matter of weeks. As they left, they were instructed to sabotage what they left behind. Files were shredded, government records were destroyed, equipment was dismantled or rendered unusable, medicine was taken from hospitals, blueprints were burned. The country's telephone infrastructure was ripped out. In some cases, light bulbs were removed from their sockets. The instruction from Paris, according to multiple sources, was "leave nothing useful behind." It was described in French as un divorce sans pension alimentaire, a divorce without alimony. Then France launched Operation Persil, a covert intelligence operation documented and later acknowledged by French intelligence sources, in which large quantities of counterfeit Guinean francs were printed in France and flooded into the Guinean economy. The operation was named after a detergent brand. Its purpose was to trigger hyperinflation and collapse Guinea's new national currency before it could establish itself. According to the former head of France's external intelligence service, Maurice Robert, who later acknowledged the operation, France launched a series of armed operations using local mercenaries with the aim of developing a climate of insecurity and, if possible, overthrow Sékou Touré. Sékou Touré survived, but Guinea paid an enormous price for its independence. The economy was severely disrupted. The country turned to the Soviet Union for support. Touré's government became increasingly authoritarian as it fought off repeated destabilization attempts. The human rights record deteriorated severely. A country that had taken the most courageous path to genuine independence spent decades in crisis, in significant part because France had done everything in its power to make that independence fail. French Prime Minister Georges Pompidou in 1962 sent a private warning to African colonies that were considering leaving the Franc zone. He said, "Let us allow the experience of Sékou Touré to run its course." The message was received. The lesson was learned. Leave the CFA franc and France will destroy you. There was one other country that tried. Togo's first president, Sylvanus Olympio, an LSE graduate, a former Unilever executive, a pragmatic modernizer, not a radical at all, began creating a national central bank and a Togolese national currency in December 1962. He was killed on the 13th of January 1963 by Togolese soldiers trained by France in the first military coup in post-independence West Africa. Togo's national currency never saw the light of day. The message needed no further clarification. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and follow the channel. It helps these stories travel further, and it means you'll be part of a growing community discovering the past. I'd love to have you on that journey. Today, the CFA franc operates as two separate currencies, though they are worth the same amount and function identically. The West African CFA franc is used by 8 countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. The Central African CFA franc is used by 6: Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and the Republic of Congo. They are not interchangeable with each other. A CFA franc from Senegal cannot be directly converted into a CFA franc from Cameroon. They are two separate currency zones, operating in parallel, united only by their relationship with France. The system rests on 4 pillars. Pillar 1, the fixed exchange rate. Both CFA francs are fixed to the euro at exactly 655.957 CFA francs per euro. This rate is set by the European Central Bank. The African nations using the CFA franc have no say whatsoever in that decision. Their monetary policy is not run from Dakar or Kinshasa or Yaoundé. It is run from Frankfurt. Pillar 2. Convertibility guarantee. France guarantees that CFA francs can always be converted into euros at the fixed rate. This is the central selling point of the system. The argument its defenders make most forcefully. The guarantee means CFA franc countries cannot experience the kind of currency crises that have devastated countries like Zimbabwe or, more recently, Ghana and Nigeria, whose currencies have lost significant value against international markets. This is a genuine advantage. It is also not free. The convertibility guarantee gives France enormous leverage over CFA franc member states because France can threaten to withdraw the guarantee, effectively collapsing the currency overnight. As a political tool, it has done so. We will see how. Pillar 3. The operations account. This is the most technically complex and most politically significant element of the system. To underwrite the convertibility guarantee, member states' central banks are required to deposit a portion of their foreign exchange reserves, the money that countries earn from exports and use to pay for imports, in a special account at the French Treasury in Paris. At its peak, this requirement stood at 100% of foreign reserves. It was subsequently reduced to 65%, then 50%. In 2019, a partial reform abolished this requirement for the 8 West African CFA franc countries, though the central bank still maintains a relationship with the French Treasury that critics argue preserves the essential dependency. For the 6 Central African countries, the 50% deposit requirement remains unchanged as of 2026. What does this mean in practice? It means that money earned from Congolese oil, Gabonese manganese, Cameroonian cocoa, money that could be invested in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and local industry, is instead sitting in an account in Paris. The African central banks do earn interest on these deposits, but critics, including the leading economist Ndongo Samba Sylla, argue that the interest paid has historically been far below what those reserves could have earned if invested productively within Africa, and more fundamentally, that the principle of holding African sovereign reserves in a foreign treasury is a structural violation of monetary sovereignty regardless of the interest rate. Pillar 4. Institutional representation. France holds seats on the boards of both the West African and Central African central banks. Until a 2010 reform of the West African Bank, France's representative had a voting seat on the Monetary Policy Committee. After the reform, France's role was somewhat reduced but remains present. France's representative attends board meetings. France must be informed before any change to the exchange rate parity. Any fundamental change to the monetary agreements requires French approval. Put those 4 pillars together and you have a system in which 14 sovereign African nations cannot set their own interest rates, cannot devalue their currency to boost exports when needed, cannot use their own foreign reserves for domestic investment without French involvement, and cannot change the fundamental terms of their monetary relationship without French consent. That is not monetary cooperation between equals, that is monetary subordination. The CFA franc defenders often present it as a purely technical monetary arrangement, a neutral tool for economic stability. The history of how it has actually been used tells a different story. The first and most dramatic demonstration of France's power over the system came in January 1994. For years leading up to that date, the CFA franc had been overvalued relative to the currencies of competing countries. CFA zone exports had become too expensive on world markets. The economies of member states were struggling. Economists had been calling for a devaluation for years. The decision to devalue, and by how much, was made in Paris. On the 14th of January 1994, without meaningful consultation with the African governments whose economies would be affected, France devalued the CFA franc by 50% overnight. Prices of imported goods, food, medicine, fuel doubled instantly. Governments that had incurred debts in French francs now owed twice as much. Wages, already low, were halved in real terms. The human cost was catastrophic. That is not the decision of an equal partner. That is the decision of a colonial administrator. The second case is even more revealing. In 2010, Ivory Coast held a presidential election. The incumbent, Laurent Gbagbo, lost to Alassane Ouattara, a former IMF official and longtime ally of France. Gbagbo refused to concede. A political standoff followed. The French government, under President Nicolas Sarkozy, sided forcefully with Ouattara. The tools it deployed went well beyond diplomacy. It pressured the BCEAO, the West African Central Bank, to freeze the accounts of the Gbagbo government, blocking its access to the state's financial resources. French banks in Ivory Coast were instructed to close. The French Ministry of Finance suspended Ivory Coast's access to the operations account, effectively cutting the government off from its own reserves and making it impossible to pay salaries, import goods, or function as a state. Ivory Coast's budget minister at the time, Justin Kone Katinan, described what happened. "I witnessed the reality of Francafrique with my own eyes." French military forces ultimately intervened directly, engaging Gbagbo's forces and enabling Ouattara to take power. Gbagbo was arrested and transferred to the International Criminal Court, a process France facilitated. Whatever one thinks of Gbagbo's conduct in the election, the episode demonstrated something that could not be unseen. The CFA Franc system gave France the ability to financially strangle a sitting African government that it had decided must go. The currency was weaponized. In 2010, not in 1960, in 2010. It also explained something that had puzzled outside observers for decades: why the longest ruling leaders in the world are disproportionately concentrated in the CFA Franc zone. The Bongo family in Gabon from 1967, Paul Biya in Cameroon from 1982, Teodoro Obiang in Equatorial Guinea from 1979, Denis Sassou Nguesso in Congo-Brazzaville, ruling for most of the period since 1979. These are not leaders who survived through competence or popularity. They survived because France kept them in power in exchange for their cooperation with the Franc zone and removed leaders who did not cooperate. We will cover this topic of African democracy and long-ruling, aging politicians in more details in an upcoming video. Please subscribe to this channel to stay in the know. The CFA Franc's defenders make a genuine economic argument that must be engaged with honestly. The fixed exchange rate and French convertibility guarantee have provided monetary stability. Inflation in CFA Franc countries has historically been lower than in many neighboring non-CFA African countries. The currency has not collapsed. It has not experienced the hyperinflation that destroyed Zimbabwe's economy or the severe devaluations that periodically disrupt Ghana's cedi or Nigeria's naira. These are real advantages. They are not nothing, and any serious analysis of the CFA Franc must acknowledge them. But stability is not the same as development, and the economic record of CFA Franc countries raises serious questions about whether monetary stability, purchased at the cost of monetary sovereignty, has translated into meaningful improvement in the lives of the people who use the currency. Consider these data points. Ivory Coast, the largest economy in the West African Franc zone, representing approximately 35% of the zone's entire GDP, reached its peak income per capita in 1978, more than 45 years ago. Niger, despite sitting on some of the world's largest uranium reserves, reached its peak income per capita in 1965, 60 years ago. Both countries have been in the CFA Franc zone throughout this period. Their monetary stability did not produce sustained economic growth. The structural reason, economists argue, is that the fixed exchange rate systematically undermines export competitiveness. When a country's trading partners devalue their currencies, making their exports cheaper, a CFA Franc country cannot respond. Its currency stays fixed, its goods remain expensive, its exports decline, its trade deficit grows, it borrows more. For oil exporting nations within the Franc zone, Cameroon, Gabon, Chad, the Republic of Congo, the fixed euro peg creates a specific and additional problem. Oil is priced and traded in US dollars. When the dollar strengthens against the euro, oil revenues shrink in CFA Franc terms even when the oil price remains stable. The countries cannot adjust. Interregional trade among CFA Franc member states, which should logically be stimulated by sharing a currency, remains remarkably low. After 6 decades, trade between CMAC members averages approximately 5% of their total commerce. Trade between UEMOA members averages around 12%. these are not the numbers of a successful monetary union. Between August 2020 and July 2023, 6 successful military coups took place in West and Central Africa. Mali in August 2020 and again in May 2021. Guinea in September 2021, Burkina Faso in January 2022 and then again in September 2022, Niger in July 2023. Chad also experienced a succession crisis in 2021 when its president was killed and his son assumed power in a military transfer. All of these countries are in the CFA Franc zone. All were experiencing worsening insecurity from jihadist insurgencies. All were frustrated with French military operations, Operation Barkhane and its predecessors, that had been fighting in the region for a decade without producing security. And all were expressing, through their new military governments, a rage at the economic and political structures of Francafrique, the French neo-colonial network of which the CFA Franc is the monetary spine. The sequence matters. In 2022, Mali's military government terminated its defense agreements with France and demanded the withdrawal of French forces. In January 2023, Burkina Faso's military demanded the withdrawal of 400 French special forces within a month. After Niger's July 2023 coup, French forces were expelled from the country by December of that year, the last of France's military allies in the Sahel, ending a French military presence that had existed for over 6 decades. The United States was also affected. Niger had been one of Washington's most important military partners in West Africa, hosting a $110 million drone base at Agadez. By early August 2024, all U.S. military personnel had been withdrawn from Niger. In September 2023, Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES, a mutual defense pact and, subsequently, a full confederation with its own flag, its own passports, and its own stated ambition to eventually federate into a single sovereign state. In January 2025, the 3 countries formally withdrew from ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, marking the most significant crisis in West African regional integration since ECOWAS was founded in 1975. And the CFA Franc? In late 2023, the finance ministers of all 3 AES countries met and declared their intentions to establish their own monetary union, their own currency, their own central bank, independence from the CFA Franc system. Niger's foreign minister stated explicitly, "Sovereignty begins with currency. The AES will exit the CFA Franc." As of 2026, no concrete exit timeline has been formally agreed and announced. The AES countries still use the CFA Franc in daily commerce. The challenges of building a new currency, managing existing CFA-denominated debt, creating new institutions, establishing a functioning central bank are real and significant. Economists warn of potential inflation and instability during any transition period. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. The political will to leave has never been stronger. New partnerships with Russia, China, and regional African powers are providing alternatives to French economic and security relationships. A November 2024 survey across West and Central Africa found that nearly 95% of respondents expressed a desire to leave the franc zone. 95%. That is not a fringe position, that is the near unanimous view of the people who use this currency. In December 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron and Ivory Coast's President Alassane Ouattara held a joint press conference and announced what they described as a landmark reform of the West African CFA franc. The currency would be renamed the ECO. The requirement to deposit reserves in Paris would be abolished. France's representative seats on the central bank board would be removed. Western media greeted this as a historic moment. Many headlines declared the CFA franc dead. In reality, the reform was considerably less than advertised. The currency remains pegged to the euro at the same fixed rate. France continues to guarantee its convertibility. No change to that parity can be made without France's involvement. The name ECO, announced in 2019, has still not been formally implemented as of 2026. The 6 Central African CFA franc nations were not included in the reform at all. Their operations account requirements, their reserve deposits in Paris, their institutional arrangements with France remain entirely unchanged. The reform abolished the most visible and most criticized element of the system, the mandatory reserve deposits in Paris, while leaving its fundamental architecture intact, the euro peg, the French guarantee, and the dependence on European central bank monetary policy. Critics described it as a rebranding exercise, a new label on an old bottle. Let us bring this together. The CFA franc was created in 1945 as a colonial monetary instrument, designed to protect France's access to African resources by keeping the currencies of its colonies pegged, convertible, and financially integrated with metropolitan France. The name said it plainly at its creation, the franc of the French colonies of Africa. When those colonies became independent in the 1960s, France used a combination of financial sabotage, assassination, and political patronage to ensure that almost all of them kept the currency. The lesson of Guinea and of Togo was delivered clearly enough that for decades no African leader dared challenge the system publicly without paying an immediate price. The system has provided real monetary stability. This is true and should not be dismissed, but it has done so at the cost of monetary sovereignty, the ability of African governments to use their own currencies as a tool of economic development, to adjust exchange rates in response to shocks, to keep their own reserves working for their own economies. Thomas Sankara named it financial slavery in 1987. He was murdered 10 weeks later. Modibo Keita of Mali tried to leave the franc zone in 1962 and was overthrown in a French-supported coup in 1968. Sylvanus Olympio of Togo began building a national central bank in December 1962 and was assassinated in January 1963. The pattern is not coincidental. What is different now, in 2026, is that the popular pressure against the system has reached a scale and intensity that cannot be managed by the old methods. The coups in the Sahel were not simply military power grabs. They were, and the evidence for this is overwhelming, expressions of popular rage at exactly the system we have been describing, at the French military presence, at the Francafrique patronage networks, at the CFA franc. 95% of West Africans want out. 6 countries have had coups that cited French economic and political influence as a primary grievance. France has been expelled from its last Sahelian military bases. The architecture of Francafrique is collapsing in real time. Whether the AES countries succeed in building a genuine monetary alternative without triggering the kind of economic crisis that the system's defenders predict is one of the most consequential questions in African economics right now. The honest answer is that it is difficult, the risks are real, and the outcome is genuinely uncertain. But here is what is certain. The conversation Sankara tried to start in 1987 is finally being had, at a scale he could not have imagined, by a generation that knows exactly what they are walking away from. Tell me in the comments, did you know about the CFA franc before this video? Do you live in a CFA franc country? What does it feel like to hold a currency whose fundamental terms were decided in Paris in 1945? And if you are watching from outside the franc zone, from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, or the diaspora, what do you think? Is monetary sovereignty worth the risks that come with it? Like, comment, share this with someone, subscribe and hit the notification bell.